Okay, well, good morning, everyone. My name's John Broom. I'm the CEO of the AANA. We'll get going. There's people still joining us, but they'll catch up most probably, certainly in this introductory section. We've got a broad cross-section of the industry on the call today, representing every point on the ad tech supply chain, from marketers all the way through to publishers. So it's great to see everyone coming together for this session. Because we all share the common purpose around having a healthy and productive digital ecosystem. The digital supply chain, as we all know, is now well established and a very, very important part of every marketer's marketing mix. And despite its complexity and constantly evolving nature, we all benefit from cross-industry initiatives that instill trust and confidence in its use and growth going forward. One of those initiatives is the Australian Digital Advertising Practices, otherwise, as we call them, the ADAPs, first published 2 years ago, a collaboration between the AANA, the IAB, and the MFA. Today, we announced the publication of an updated set of practices and some important developments on how they will be embedded across the industry. But if we go to the next slide, please, Tiff. So what we'll be holding is a panel session, which is the main part of the this morning's call, and I'll introduce the speakers in a moment. But prior to that, myself, Sophie Madden, as CEO of the MFA, and Gay Leroy, who you all know as CEO of the IAB, will tell you a little bit about what the ADAPs are and why we have them. Before I do that, before I kick that off, let me introduce the other speakers with us today. Let me welcome Nadia Cameron, from CMO Australia, the editor for CMO Australia. Nadia's going to moderate a session between our three chairs and really probe into, and she's got full editorial license to do this, by the way, why this initiative is important and what it means for our market. And on the panel are the three chairs of our three associations: Martin Brown from Nestlé Oceania, Matt Rowley, who many of you already know, and of course, Peter Horgan, chair of the MFA. So guys, welcome, and welcome Nadia, and thank you very much for your time in investing in this. If I could take the next slide, please, Tiff. Before we go there, though, I just wanted to explain a little bit for those who are not so sure about what the ADAPs are. Let me give you a short introduction. The good way of looking at the ADAPs is through what I call the 3 E's. Their purpose really is to educate, providing a common understanding of the digital advertising ecosystem, and equally dispel some of the common misunderstandings that we're all dealing with. Secondly, to encourage shared responsibility, ensuring advertisers, agencies, publishers, and digital platforms have shared insights and responsibilities for digital spends and the business outcomes, obviously, marketers are all looking for. And then perhaps the most importantly, to enable trust and confidence in the digital advertising ecosystem. And to do that, we founded the ADAPs 2 years ago on 5 key principles. First and foremost, which I think is a clearly obvious one, we're here to champion the consumer experience. Better user experience will lift all the metrics and deliver all the business outcomes that every aspect of the ecosystem is looking for. Secondly, to use education to inspire change. There's obviously lots of different ways we can do change, but education plays a big role. So therefore, through best practice education and clear understanding of metrics, we want to see change come from that. Education is a better way to do things than trying to mandate or force change. Thirdly, shared ownership and responsibility. And this applies equally to marketers as it does to any other participant in the supply chain. All participants need to take responsibility for their own knowledge and understanding. Because at the end of the day, knowledge, builds better outcomes. And we've got to also respect that every value chain is unique and different. No two advertisers have exactly the same supply chain. So the approach to improving value needs to be optimized for each advertiser's needs and partner agreements. So therefore, it's really, really important that marketers invest the time and take accountability for understanding the decisions that they're making. and the choices that they're making. And then, of course, finally, we have to offer fair value for the outcomes delivered. Value is created through quality and price. Therefore, adopting best practices to deliver better outcomes may indeed actually cost more. If we want greater visibility or transparency, then of course we must invest in the systems that enable that for us. So those are the 5 principles that that we set up in the first place. I'll now hand over to Sophie, who will take us through the core elements.
Thanks, John, and good morning, everyone. So let me first start by saying that the digital ad practices, or ADAPs, as John pointed out, is a cross-industry initiative. We all have long been of the view that greater trust and confidence in the digital value chain requires industry-wide solutions, and this position has recently been reinforced by the ISBA UK study. The 2020 Australian digital ad practices are a culmination of months of work by a cross-industry team made up of advertisers, media agencies, digital publishers and ad tech companies. And I'd like to thank, on behalf of all of us, those people for the enormous amount of work and effort that they've put into making this initiative happen. Because as you know, these things are never easy. The digital practices cover 6 key topics. These topics were identified by the stakeholders, by all 3 industry bodies, as being the key digital issues that need to be addressed through education and clarification. These being the digital value chain, viewability, ad fraud, brand safety, data governance, and consumer privacy. And importantly, it looks at all these 6 areas together with easy to implement tools and practical steps. And it's important to point out what the practices are and what they're not. They're not trying to be a silver bullet to solve everything. They are a starting point. They're designed to inform and educate, as John pointed out. They're to help people make the best possible advertising investment decisions for their individual brands and businesses. Consumers will continue to increase the amount of time that they spend with content and services to deliver digitally. It's our responsibility, collectively, all of us, to ensure that we continue to develop our industry in a way that truly delivers the best outcome for the market. So let's have a look at the 5 modules that make up the practices. Digital value chain looks at the supply chain, clarifying the different elements, including the various digital advertising and trading models. It gives clear guidance on the role of the different ad tech elements and what they can play, and how to determine what is appropriate for the different buying circumstances and outcomes. Ensuring that digital advertising can be seen by a human is critical to deliver effective digital campaigns. Practices provide clear tools and information for how digital publishers, creative agencies, media agencies, and advertisers can all play a role and work together to improve the viewability. And whilst ad fraud and brand safety are 2 really important and different issues, they represent significant challenges for advertisers. But the tools and steps to address them are often the same. So this module covers both these areas, advising clients on how to avoid buying fraudulent inventory, how to establish practices for brand safe and brand suitable inventory, and importantly, what to do if there's a breach. And with the ever-increasing volume of data available in market, good data stewardship is critical to both advertiser and long-term usability. The data governance module provides guidance for all players to employ robust governance practices to ensure that we responsibly use audience data segments in a simple, trustworthy and transparent manner. And finally, consumer privacy. Consumer trust is the lifeblood of digital media. Data practices must respect and protect consumer interests. The consumer privacy module outlines practical steps on how to deploy and maintain best practice privacy and security controls that comply with the law, increase consumer confidence, and better manage any post-breach incidents. For those of you familiar with the previous version, you'll note that the biggest change, one of the biggest change, is this expanded section on consumer privacy and the practices. And there'll be further ongoing updates to the practices to align them with future market changes. The practices are an open system. They're accessible for all to use. They are available for download and can be found on the AANA, IAB and MFA websites. There should be a link in the chat box for you now for the URLs for that. And that's what they are. So I'd like to hand over to Nadia and the panel to discuss the role and impact of the initiative.
Thank you for that, Sophie, and lovely to be with all of you today and be discussing what is obviously a very big, crucial, important topic that our industry needs to get their heads around. So just as a starting point with the panel, what I thought I'd do is ask our three lovely gentlemen to tell me at a top line level, what is it that you're each hoping to achieve, what these latest practices will achieve from your respective positions in this ecosystem? What does success actually look like? And how far does this addition of the practices mature the dialogue? Martin, you're in my top right-hand corner, so I'm going to start with you.
Hi, Nadia, and hi, everyone. Like, I think, firstly, let's acknowledge that this is a very complex ecosystem that we're working within. It's very technology-driven. It's rapidly adapting. And I think education and knowledge is key in order to understand from an advertiser perspective, what's the right tailoring of the ecosystem for you. And what we're hoping to provoke from this, and I'm incredibly proud of the industry collaboration behind this, these ADAP principles. We're hoping to provoke, based on having a common level of knowledge of this ecosystem, the right discussions and dialogues between advertiser and agency partner about what is the right value chain that is appropriate for the advertiser's needs, so that we're delivering great consumer outcomes. We're doing it efficiently so that marketing ROI is front and center, that we're doing it in a way that brand safety in what is increasingly a kind of dynamic risk environment to manage is preserved, and that the community expectations around privacy and data governance are absolutely without reproach. And I think those dialogues are really important to get what we're all after.
Yeah, absolutely. Peter, from your position, what are you hoping these practices will actually achieve, and how much further do you see them pursuing that dialogue that we need to have, or as Martin put it, that common language that we need to create across the ecosystem?
I think firstly we need to acknowledge that there was a crisis in trust over the last 5 years, and a lot of that is at the doorstep of agencies and some of the opportunistic behaviour that took place over that period. And I think Martin's absolutely right. I think what we're pushing for here in the second stage, and it's an ongoing journey, is trust through knowledge. That we are speaking with a common voice, that marketers are sufficiently empowered with the right language, the right conversations, and the right questions to ask their agency, that they can weave their way through the complex digital supply chain with confidence that they are getting fair value and that the agencies are acting in their best interest. And really, look, selfishly from an agency perspective, we are about aggregating expertise to deliver return on investment outcomes and performance outcomes for advertisers. And fundamentally, if there is that lack of trust, then advertisers will feel more and more compelled to bring those capabilities in-house, regardless of whether that is suboptimal for them or not. And I think in the re-establishment of trust, we'll get back to a position of advertisers' clients being confident to tap into the pool of expertise that agencies can deliver. I think the second thing is sustainability, a sustainable ecosystem that taps into the true potential that digital can provide, and then finally performance, that we're delivering return and business outcomes for clients through the right conversations.
Yeah. And Matt, over to you. I mean, how from your position does that correlate with what Martin and what Peter have just said there in terms of what these practices really need to achieve from a success point of view?
Yeah, I mean, from the supply side, I mean, there's so much that you can do with that digital advertising, right? You can do things now that we never dreamed you'd be able to do. But if you can't get over some of those fundamental building blocks, which I think Peter was kind of referring to, of kind of like trust and knowledge and understanding, you don't get to that point. It just feels like it's either too hard or kind of there be dragons. And so I think what ADAPs does is it helps kind of break down those barriers that, you know, whether it's lack of knowledge or lack of trust, it helps to take care of those things. And actually, I remember back to when we were putting the first version together, and back then viewability was the thing, right? It was like in every article, is everything everyone was talking about, people were obsessing about it. It was the biggest reason why you couldn't use digital advertising and all the rest of it. And like over time, don't get me wrong, it's still an important thing, but you know, it's through understanding, and people have realized it's a more nuanced conversation. They realize it's just not one number, all these sorts of things. And I think, hey, I'm going to put that all down to ADAPs 1.0. But, you know, I think it's one of those things that with more education and understanding, then you can kind of knock that barrier down and continue on and do the great things. And I think this version of ADAPs then looks forward to where we can potentially see other potential pitfalls and looks to kind of shore those things up, you know, now, so that we can keep that sort of, as Peter was saying, that sort of trust and understanding and education going, so that we don't hit those barriers.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been well noted already that this latest edition makes a plea for all players within the digital ecosystem, rather than just advertisers, to familiarise themselves with the content. What's this saying about the nature of collaboration, coherence, and collective responsibility, and how that needs to evolve in our industry? Peter, can I throw that to you? Because you sort of stated there that clearly we have had that crisis in trust. We have had that concern, and potentially had some blaming as well, going, you know, in different directions. So, I mean, how does this plea within this latest version of ADAPs really point to the collective responsibility that we have as an industry?
I think the fact that it is tripartite and brings together advertisers, agencies, and publishers, all with the experts within each of those three communities, ironing out the creases and finding common ground of what is going to provide utility for each of those parties across that ecosystem has been absolutely pivotal. And I think it's world leading from that perspective. It builds on a lot of other initiatives that are working out across the industry, such as the contract guidance initiative of last year, which again, you know, picks at some of the elephants in the room, or the unspoken topics as they were 2 or 3 years ago, and really shines a light on things that people really didn't want to talk about, and to use Pritchard's language, the opaque or murky supply chain. But beyond transparency, really digs into the 5 pillars, as Sophie mentioned, and gives the fundamentals that is going to solve and lead to a more effective digital ecosystem. And as Matt said, you know, untaps, you know, the incredible potential that exists therein to drive outcomes for advertisers.
Martin, that's probably a good time to come to you. Why is it so imperative for the brands to be building internal knowledge? I'm just thinking of the conversations I have with CMOs. I won't say lack of interest, but the lack of detailed knowledge around how this ecosystem works is extensive. So, I mean, why is it so imperative that brands really start to build that internal knowledge of some of these details?
I think, yeah, it's, you know, CMOs are dealing with very complex roles at the moment. And so when you dive into the level of detail in the digital supply chain, this is an area where you need true expertise in order to find the unique solution that you need to pay for your own needs. And I think that investing in that level of expertise, whether or not it's your own knowledge, if you're a small, medium-sized business, or getting the expert resources you need if you're in a larger business, where some of those choices that you can make are actually much more significant about taking a more proactive role in how you're buying, or the partnerships that you set up. You know, that's an investment in time and knowledge that will pay back significantly. And you know, there are very, very different starting points for advertisers at different levels, and not everyone's got the global resources in order to navigate their way around direct relationships with tier one supply side platforms. What you at least need to be armed with is the knowledge in order to have a more constructive discussion with your agency partner. And they need to be based on also an understanding. I think the last point around brand safety is that the risk profile in brand safety in this environment is so much more dynamic than it used to be. The principles are the same, but the risk level is much more dynamic and daily topical. So you have to be on top of this, because this is quite fundamental to management of your brand. So not a choice anymore, lots of tools to lean into.
Yeah, fair point. And when you're saying environment, you're talking about the digital advertising, digital marketing landscape, not specific to the COVID environment, because I will ask a little bit about how that's impacted things shortly. But before I do, when the initial practices were launched, John had suggested a situation where problems typically emerge in the chain as at an individual advertiser level, and when they're actually literally sitting working around the table. And at the time, he'd said to me, that's where the rubber really has to hit the road in terms of working effectively. And I wonder whether you guys can share practical scenarios or situations where you're seeing where the practices could practically assist with a client or an advertiser or an agency situation. Can I perhaps, who wants to take that one first? Peter, I think I'm looking at you. I think Peter,
sorry. Can you repeat that? There was a truck going past outside. You broke up.
Oh, the joys of virtual events. In terms, when the inaugural practices came out, John had made a comment that where the problems typically emerge is very much where you're literally sitting at a table in the midst of a negotiation of some description. He said that's where the rubber really hits the road in terms of where we're struggling to work together. And I'm just asking if there's a practical scenario where you could see these practices coming into play that would actually help overcome that sort of issue.
I think that it's end to end across the supply chain. I think through the value chain, through the restoration of trust, in viewability, having sensible conversations rather than viewability has to be 100%, or people chasing price and nobody seeing their campaigns. That there's an active dynamic. So having the right conversations around that. Ad fraud and brand safety, two separate areas, but with common tools used to solve. Data governance, as we all set ourselves up for GDPR as a minimum, and the impending legislation here, how we're preparing our data architecture that we're all compliant, and then in consumer privacy, so we're not poisoning the well and making it a toxic environment for consumers. I think so, end to end.
Yeah. Okay. Matt, the ISBA UK's report, which came out a couple of months back, painted a pretty stark picture of the murkiness, to use that term, of the programmatic advertising supply chain and the rather urgent gap that needs addressing there. I mean, we have 15 advertisers involved and already saw 15% on average of the spend not being attributable. What's your view on the importance of that report, and how would you position those findings against the practices and the ways with which you guys are working to try and put some practicalities out there?
Yeah, I think the ISBA report was a really good example, and probably the latest example of something that can help generate, I guess, like the phrase I talked about earlier on, that kind of there be dragons. Oh my God, is it the Wild West in there, sort of what's going on. But actually, it's also sort of a great example of where things have kind of are rapidly changing, you know, for the better. So, for example, there's a whole number of sort of tech standards that for the IAB Tech Labs that we've been introducing. You know, whether it's ads.txt, sellers.json, and then there's another one right now called supply chain object, which is kind of implemented on the SSP side, and we're just waiting for it to be kind of more taken up on the sort of the buyer side. But these things, these standards mean that you can actually track each impression all the way through the chain. And so one of the things, whereas, for example, the ISBA study, so I think they only got like a match of like 12% on all the impressions that went through. And it's basically because they did it pretty much manually. They basically looked at, you know, logs at either end, and they tried to match impressions by times that they were bought and sold and things like that. And that's why it took them 18 months. It was a complete nightmare. Anyone who knows what those sorts of things look like will know why that's a disaster. But it's kind of, in a way, it's kind of like, it's very much old tech. It's very much the old way it was done. And there are so many new things. And that's why understanding, you know, that sort of value supply chain as we've got, and which has been updated in the latest version, understanding that and understanding what's available to you, because those things are there. And actually, it's one of the things that we're talking about at the IAB is, you know, basically repeating a similar experiment, but using these standards, which means instantly you can track that impression all the way through, and you know everyone who's touched it, and you can, you know, and you'll see everything from end to end. So I think it was probably a great example, a great example in a bad way of where things have been and sort of not where they're kind of going to, or where they are actually now. These tools are at our fingertips. And I think so a mixture of education, which exactly what ADAPs does, so you can understand what's available and why it's there and what value it's adding, but then B, also what tools are available to you to make sure you don't get that ISBA experience, because, you know, actually now the tools are there to make sure that you don't, that you can track and see how that goes all the way through. And that's something that we're doing a lot of work on at the IAB at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm realizing we've got a very short amount of time left for our actual panel discussion. So I thought maybe if I can ask just a sort of a last question. Obviously, each of the 5 modules make it very clear that trust is front and center with the practices and exactly what we need to be trying to address, and, you know, good things will follow. Can you guys just suggest one thing each of you has taken away, or perhaps either a learning around that, a surprise, a horror, a discovery from working through these practices that you're really hoping will start to be solved through the sector moving forward? So Martin, I'll start with you.
Yeah, firstly, I'd say I'm very confident about just the sense of collaboration across the industry and the desire to educate and share knowledge in a more transparent manner. I think that's actually something that we should all be motivated by, and that's the expectation that consumers should have also of us, that we're working collaboratively to deliver a great experience bound by privacy requirements. In terms of, you know, key learning, look, knowledge is so key. And I'd say that from an advertiser perspective, how you can integrate data, media, and content together in the way in which you really think about the power of programmatic media is and programmatic buying is so critical. Done well, this can be a really an effective competitive differentiator for you, but you have to lean in and build the knowledge in your team.
Thank you for that. Matt, can I ask you that same question?
Yeah, look, I think if you, for example, have a look at, data governance and consumer privacy, and you kind of work through that and you think about it, and then you think about some of the conversations you've bumped into sometimes, probably more in the past, and you think, have people really got their head around that and sort of what that means, especially going forward? Hawgs touched on, for example, if there's something GDPR-like, that comes into the ecosystem, I think that takes a lot of thinking. I mean, we saw what happened in the UK, when people, that hadn't probably been thought through as well as it could, and sort of how it hits the industry. So every time I read anything around that sort of, consumer privacy, also the tech changes that are coming with third-party cookies and all these sorts of things, there are a lot of things that we're just about to hit that I think it's almost like, it's how do you find the time almost to kind of, put that aside, working in a partnership to figure out what's that going to mean to us? What do we need to do? What do we need to have in place? And I think that's something that these ADAPs kind of work more on, is that kind of future looking, the now, but also the next. And that's something I'd recommend everybody have a bit of a squiz at.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. Peter, last word. Oh, you're on mute, Peter.
Yeah, very similar, common ground and aligned intent. You know, these are complex issues. As we were talking about earlier, you know, the ISBA report took 18 months of experts trying to navigate just a small section of the advertising community in the UK, and we're rebuilding it on the run. But there is true determination, I think, across the three entities, the three parties to this, to getting this right. And although it's complex, at least we're all aligned now and starting to move on from the you know, the innuendo that we're all working to cross purposes.
Yeah, fair point. And I think with the ad tech inquiry that's coming as well, and the paper that's due out later this year, there'll be a lot more dialogue to come. But for now, I've run out of time. So Gay, I'm handing back over to you.
Thanks, Nadia, and thanks, gentlemen. All right, so I'm going to wrap up the main part of the presentation before hopefully we get to a little bit of time for some questions that are coming through. And I'm going to talk about next steps. I guess the first thing to note, the good news from round one is that when these practices are used and taken seriously, they do work. We've heard from Martin about, you know, Nestlé's view of the world. I'm going to share one quote. So McDonald's are also quite strong users of these. So Chris Graham, who's the global head of media accountability, has been a big fan, have used this. So it's not only been an important part of the business, but they also feel like it gives them a competitive edge. So that is pleasing. So Sophie's talked through a little bit of the changes in terms of content. The other big change for the release is a renewed investment and energy around education and training. All three bodies are committed to the success of the program and are going to support the adoption through a range of training initiatives that are going to be rolled out over the coming months. So they'll include e-learning, face-to-face training, advertiser workshops, and whatever else we need to do to make sure these are embedded. I'm really thrilled that the MFA board, the agencies as part of the MFA board, are committed to ensuring that all their relevant agency staff are going to undertake ADAPT training programs and complete a proof of knowledge. So that will ensure that the industry gets a really thorough understanding that agencies can discuss these issues with their clients. Embedding is going to be incredibly important. So off the back of awareness and education and training, making sure that these practices are actually embedded in the workflow for all parts of the ecosystem. The panel to date have discussed all the different reports that are coming out. So ACCC, ISBA, etc. They all point to very similar solutions and ways of looking at things. Increased transparency, education, industry standards are going to be part of those solutions, and the ADAPs are a key part of that in market. And as Matt mentioned, there are a lot of industry standards that have been developed that we can do a better job of adopting, and there are more to come. Measuring success. So as I mentioned, awareness is key. First time round, we did have thousands of people downloading and using these. And reference, we will be tracking awareness. Adoption will be the key point this time. We'll be doing this through industry surveys and regularly tapping in with all of our members and tracking the training side of things. How to engage. So for the people on the call and the people who are using these documents, many of them are members of the 3 industry associations. Please feel free to get in contact with your relevant industry association. Look, the first step is really to download the document. It's designed to be read in close to an hour. I do get feedback that sometimes it takes a little bit longer than that, but that's your first challenge, to have a read, absorb and go through it. And they are written to suit all levels of people, whether they've come from a digital background or not, senior or juniors. They are written in fairly easy to understand language. A little bit more technical this time as the industry matures, but still hopefully not too acronym driven. So as I said, please get in contact with Sophie, John and myself if you want more details. We will get to some questions. We will be following up with lots of industry programs. So just wanted to support the speakers and reiterate what an important initiative this is. And we know that agreed industry practices can help the market operate more efficiently. So I'm going to hand over to John, who's going to help drive the Q&A.
Great, thanks, Gay. We've got time just for maybe 2 or 3 questions. Let's start off with a really great question, and I'm going to give it to you, Hawks. So the question, given the talk of transparency and proof points of value, do you believe there is room for non-disclosed programmatic platforms, I'm assuming, more today?
Thanks, John. That's a delicious one to lead the batting with. I think with and look, non-disclosed, we're re-terming it as fixed price, really to not to disguise its makeup, just to sort of line it up with broader commercial principles. And I think with fixed price, there is a disconnect between definition and practice in the industry. You know, I think it's perfectly legitimate for an advertiser or any commercial entity to outsource risk and ask a third party to take on that risk and deliver a certain price for a commodity, for whatever it is. And that's, you know, as long as there's understanding between both parties, there's nothing wrong with that, and it's pretty ubiquitous across the commercial universe. I think the problem here is what is real risk, and I think fixed price was used certainly in recent years and the earlier days of programmatic, opportunistically by agencies, and how much real risk was there, and was the margin fair and sustainable. Our view is that, I suppose, look, speaking as Omnicom, we don't do any, we insist that all aspects of the supply chain, publisher, supply chain pricing, publisher, agency fees and tech fees are all completely disclosed. So I suppose I can only answer that by saying the way we behave within our own entity, that it's 100% disclosed. But if there are entities there that are happy with fixed price and there's a fair balance of how risk is measured, then that is up to them.
Great. And that goes back to the point we made in one of the principles around every advertiser's needs and supply chain are unique to it. So second question, most probably the last question, given the time. In the report, you mentioned that ad fraud in Australia is only 2 to 3%, which seems extremely low compared to the rest of the world. What is this data based on? And maybe I'll push that one through to Matt.
Yeah, thanks, John. Look, I think this point is actually a great example of exactly what, you know, ADAPs is there to do, because, you know, if you just look at every reach of the internet and where you can buy an ad, that I've no doubt that you could be looking at fraud numbers that are higher than that. But if you know where you're buying and you know what standards they're using, then you're going to see it much lower than that. My understanding of that number is that it was taken from players who are using verification, and so that's why you're seeing that. I know personally, having worked with premium publishers, I mean, our numbers would be lower than that, lower than the 2 to 3%. So it really depends kind of where you're buying from and what standards that they're using. So like I say, I don't know the full detail of the reference, but it absolutely doesn't surprise me that if you're talking about people who are using verification, you'd be seeing 2 to 3 or even lower. If you don't do that and you want to go Wild West, then it is caveat emptor, and I've no doubt you could see much higher than that. So it doesn't surprise me at all.
Great, thanks very much, Matt. We are right up against the timeline. I'm going to throw to Gay to close. Thanks very much.
Thanks, John. Thanks everyone for their time. Thank you to Nadia and the panel. Please take note of the links in the chat box to download the thing. Otherwise, you can go to your favourite industry website to download the practices. As I said, please get in contact. Thank you very much for your time today. And that's it from us today. Thank you, everyone.